a very prominent educator based in Israel. And I first met Michael when he was already the head of the MTA Hachshara program. So he was running the program for Australians and South Africans, spending a year in Israel after high school, before university, studying in yeshiva and midrashah. And I grew to respect his knowledge and character very, very, very much. And it helped a lot when we both turned out to marry into the same Slonim family. So that was an added bonus. Michael Rainsbury is currently the head of adult education at the London School of Jewish Studies, which is one of the premier Jewish education institutions in England. And he is an educator for J Roots Journeys. He's led a number of Jewish heritage trips to Poland and has taught about Holocaust in many schools and youth movements as well. I think one of the great things that I'm looking forward to learning from Michael about is having not only a very in-depth theoretical knowledge of the Holocaust, but also a very profound knowledge of Judaism and halakha and Torah, and how we can connect those two very, very important worlds that define so many of our lives today. So over to you, Michael.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and Mazel Tov on your new appointments in this community. I'm sure everyone knows that they're lucky to have you, so you don't need me to say it, but I'll say it anyway. They're lucky to have you. Yeah, really, thank you very much for inviting me. And so I'll just say, I know that there are people watching on YouTube. I don't know how you can interact with asking a question, but anyone on Zoom can just ask a question. Really, my goal today is to look, what we would decide to look at is, we're looking at the Holocaust commemoration in the Jewish calendar today, and really asking the question, how should we best commemorate it? Which you might think is a strange question because we have Yom HaShoah, but it's really not a strange question. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at different approaches throughout the post-Holocaust time period, different approaches to how to understand the Holocaust in the commemoration. But by understanding the commemoration, we are really going to learn a little bit about what's behind the ideas, the different questions that people are asking. And at the end, we're going to try and give a suggestion for what to do today, which, by the way, is not simple. And I don't think there's a really, like kind of one size fits all answer. I think there's a lot more work to be done on this. So it's not just a sheer to kind of tick the box, it's a sheer to really get you thinking and about how we are going to commemorate the Holocaust in generations to come. So let me start by sharing the screen, and we shall begin. Okay, as is customary, can everyone see, can you see my notes or the next slide? Sorry, you can see the next slide. How do we change that? No, not like that.
Yeah, go to display settings up the top, and then you'll be able to click, duplicate slide view. Oh, whatever. Yeah, that should do it.
What can you see now? Sorry for
black screen. There you
go. Yeah, but that's, oh, 1 second. Here we are.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see? You can see it fine. Okay, excellent. Okay, so how should we commemorate the Holocaust in the Jewish calendar? The problem is I just got a second screen, so that's why it's kind of being a bit. Oh, and there's is that intentional? There's subtitles, live subtitles. Okay, right. Okay, let's start by talking about the first efforts to commemorate the Holocaust. Now, I find this really, really fascinating. Actually, you could do a whole talk just on how the Holocaust was commemorated in real time during the Holocaust. And this is, to me, quite mind-blowing. The first time I actually encountered this, as you mentioned, Marcus, I was I'm a guide in Poland. And one of the things that I find really remarkable when I go, I don't know if anyone here has been on a Poland trip, and Majdanek, you may have heard of, one of the kind of the most evil of all of the Nazi buildings, if there's a possible ranking order of evil, but that's Majdanek is one of the darkest places in the world. And Majdanek was liberated by the Russians before Auschwitz, because they got there before they got to Auschwitz. And already, while Auschwitz was still operating, Majdanek had become a state museum. Now that's like a mind-blowing fact. The Holocaust wasn't a kind of, there was a beginning, an announcement. Everyone, this is the beginning of the Holocaust. This is the end of the Holocaust. Like, what is the Holocaust called, right? Think about today. I was just planning an event discussing the Russia-Ukraine war. What is the name of the war? Is it the Ukraine war? Is it the invasion of Ukraine? And by the way, names are really significant because they have, the meaning is really important. I'll give you an example. What was the date? This is an introduction. Should be the name for the date that the Nazis, maybe someone needs to mute, that the Nazis burnt. No, actually, I'm giving away the question and the answer. The Jewish books in 1938. What's the most famous? What do we call that day? Anyone?
Kristallnacht.
Kristallnacht. So I've been calling it Kristallnacht for most of my life, until I found out recently that Kristallnacht was actually the Nazis' name for it. And actually, maybe a better name for that day would be the November pogrom, because the November pogrom suggests that it wasn't just about breaking Kristall, about breaking the glass. Actually, there were over 70 people who died, who were murdered by the Nazis. And we often don't think about that, because the Nazis ultimately murdered so many people that we remember that for the shuls that were destroyed, but that's not really an accurate kind of understanding of the name. Anyway, my point being that it's very hard to know the beginning and end of things when you're in it, right? We are living through COVID. When did COVID begin? When did COVID end? We'll see. History books will tell us. And we'll probably look at the history books in 50 years' time and say, no, that's not how it was. So let's go back to what happened in the day. So there's a few examples here. In Tisha B'Av 1942, and Tisha B'Av obviously is kind of the prompt for this year, like the 3 weeks. So we're going to talk about Tisha B'Av a lot. The chief rabbi of Britain is already composing a prayer for what's happening in Eastern Europe. And that's really important to understand, because when you learn the history of the Holocaust, don't get me wrong, the situation for Jews before Tisha B'Av let's say before 1942 was the worst. You would have thought that would be the worst it could get. However, we know that it got even worse. And Tisha B'Av 1942 is the day that the deportations to Treblinka from the Warsaw Ghetto started, which again is one story from the Holocaust, but it's a big story because it's hundreds of thousands of Jews. And there's already a prayer going on for the victims thus far, showing just how things unfolded. It was sufficiently bad. Also, there was knowledge of it. That's not really our topic for today, but that's worth mentioning. So already you've got something, and what really concerns us is it was on Tisha B'Av. Okay. Now, of course, in that time, they couldn't necessarily have the perspective to say, let's add another Memorial Day, which is the question we'll have later, because they're still very much in the unfolding story. A few months later, the Jewish Agency in Israel established, or the Yishuv, established 3 days of alarm, protest, and call to action, the 30th of November to the 2nd of December. And they say about 100,000 people participated in rallies, etc., for this event. Interestingly, though, Rav Herzog, who was the chief rabbi and became the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, wanted to create a day of fasting and prayer on the last of those days. And there's a story that he went to Rav Soloveitchik, not the Rav Soloveitchik that you might know, that's the Rav in America, but his uncle, who was Rav Yitzchak Soloveitchik, also known as Rav Velvel, also known as the Griz, and he was he established the Brisker Yeshiva in Jerusalem. He was very much on the kind of the Haredi side. I know that's being a little bit broad strokes, but on the kind of conservative side of things, and they had a discussion about whether to have a kind of whether this would be possible. Now he actually felt, the Griz, that it shouldn't. Okay, you shouldn't do that. He said that there is in the Kinot. Okay, Kinot, read on Tisha B'Av, the liturgical dirges, poems that we read on Tisha B'Av. One of them is called Mi Yitain Roshi Mayim, and in that Kinna there is a line that says that you essentially shouldn't, since one may not add a time for destruction, therefore today I will raise my cries of woe. That's a line from that Kinna. Okay, and he interprets that to say we can't add any more days. As in, we've got the Churban, I'm going to use the word Churban, which means destruction, which refers to what happened in the temples back in the day, and we have that. And this Kinna says there's no more days. It's been fixed. A bit like the same discussions. Not that this is our topic, obviously, but one of the arguments against Yom HaAtzmaut is the Jewish calendar is fixed. We can't add anything more. And even the religious Zionist community that does add to Yom HaAtzmaut, that it's not the same as Hanukkah and Purim, because the religious Zionist community does recognize that principle works to some extent, that you can't just create another Hanukkah or Purim in the same way that they are, or at least the majority religious Zionism thinks that. So here he's saying, the Griz says there's no more days. Now Rav Herzog disagreed, and he actually said that line in the poem is it's very specific to the poem. It's not trying to create some kind of halacha law for all time, but essentially he didn't kind of push ahead with the idea, and he didn't really return to it. So he never got his way, if you like, of creating this day of fasting and prayer. But it's a really interesting discussion, and there's many issues with that, with the line of arguing. And one of them is kind of, why should some kind of line that's written in a Kinna, why should that determine what we do nowadays? Like, is that really the understanding? But it reflected a kind of very conservative attitude amongst many rabbis to wanting to add any new days of mourning, and we're going to see that echoing throughout the generations in our next session, and as the next part. Okay, so going back to the kind of real-time commemoration, there was another effort as well. There was you can see here, week of mourning for the end of in Adar 1945, which is again towards the end. That would have been just after Auschwitz was liberated, and again, the idea of week of mourning, as in we don't really do that today, but there was another effort to really kind of commemorate the Holocaust. Okay, now, so that's the first thing. First of all, any questions before we go into our three approaches? No? Okay, good, fine. So yeah, that was the introduction, if you like. Now let's see if we can move the slide along, which would be nice. Yes. There we go. Right. Okay, let's take three approaches. Approach number one, I've entitled Yet Another Churban. What do I mean by that? Churban, destruction, is the theme of Tisha B'Av. And on Tisha B'Av, I'm sure you've been to any Tisha B'Av program or service, someone will say Tisha B'Av commemorates the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple, and a list of other things that happened. The expulsion from Spain was signed on Tisha B'Av, etc., etc. The Jews were expelled from England, all these kind of things. We commemorate it on Tisha B'Av. A lot of those things happened on Tisha B'Av. A lot of those things happened around Tisha B'Av, but we round it up, essentially. And we say that we're going to take one day. But essentially, we take Tisha B'Av as a day and we say we are commemorating all the tragedies of Jewish history. And I also use the word Churban because I mentioned before there was a question of how do you name the Holocaust, and that has become the accepted name Shoah. But there were some that disagreed, and they said that it's not it's one of the many tragedies that we've had throughout the history, and Khurban is a more appropriate term. So I'm using that intentionally. So Tisha B'Av, commemorating the Holocaust in Tisha B'Av, is the epitome of the approach that says the Holocaust was yet another Khurban, meaning it's another, you have a list of them. There are all these bad things that happened to Jewish people. It is another thing to add to the list. Okay. I want to talk about Rav Moshe Feinstein. Going to move ahead to Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein felt, and he was asked about this many times. He felt that we should only mark national tragedies on Tisha B'Av. He wasn't against establishing fast days for local events. For local tragedies. Sorry. How do you define that as an interesting question? Because there were times in history where a specific community established a fast day to commemorate some kind of pogrom in their town. He said that's okay, but when it comes to a national tragedy, it has to be marked on Tisha B'Av. And again, he very much agreed with the Griz, Rav Yitzchak Soloveitchik, that essentially everything should be brought together under one umbrella on Tisha B'Av. He was against the idea of having a separate Holocaust day. Now, going back to the idea of why that is, it goes to the question of, is the Holocaust a unique event, or is it just one of the tragedies? So I've said that is the kind of the difference, but let's understand understand a bit more. Now, Professor Yehuda Bauer, who is probably one of the world's, if not the preeminent Holocaust historian, Yad Vashem historian, he says the Holocaust is not unique because it can happen again. If you say it's unique, you're saying it can't happen again, and it can. He said it was unprecedented. That's his language. And it was unprecedented in terms of the fact that the Jewish people were targeted in an ideological, sometimes against it wasn't necessarily something that the Nazis could have had better strategy and not done it, and many other reasons. He felt that it was unprecedented, and it does deserve its a unique, some say the word unique, its own place, but he wouldn't say it's necessarily unique. That is kind of a modern understanding of the Holocaust. But one of the questions that you could ask, and this is there's no real answer to this question, is how do you then understand some of the darkest periods of Jewish history in light of that? For example, the Crusades. The Crusades in Ashkenazi Europe, Northern Europe, probably killed a similar percentage of Jews, around 1/3. Now, there were fewer Jews, and it wasn't because of there was no mass media, there was no kind of the technological advances the Nazis used in order to kill the Jews. It was very basic kind of pogroms then, but that was still a huge destruction. And actually, one of the reasons why we mourn during the period of the Omer is because of the Crusades, right? I mean, it's a different discussion, but I personally, when I think about the mourning practices in the Omer, I really don't think about Rabbi Akiva's students so much. I think about the Crusades and if you look historically, that's really the impetus for a lot of the mourning customs in the Ashkenazi world, and it was huge. So we obviously today we say, okay, the Holocaust is unprecedented, but when you look at that, in those times, for them, that was their equivalent, right? And you could say, well, they commemorated it on Tisha B'Av, but again, they also could have had their own fast days So it kind of gets very it gets messy. We don't really know. And the same thing, by the way, with the destruction of the temple and the fall of the state at that in the year 70, and in the Bar Kokhba rebellion 70 years later, which were all destructions which caused hundreds of thousands of Jews to die. And for them, again, it's different from the Holocaust, but in terms of the idea of Jewish life completely being changed irrevocably, then there are similarities there. So, we have to ask the question, where do you put the Holocaust? And it's very hard to answer that, even in this generation, because we are the generation where we still know survivors. And one of the questions will be, what's it going to be in hundreds of years' time? And I'll just throw in something that's one of the problems that we're going to encounter at the end, which is, how are we doing enough that in 1,000 years' time or 500 years' time, the Holocaust will be commemorated? Because, how much are we reliant on the emotional story that we know, and how much are we codifying this, that in the future, when there's no emotional connection, they will still know? Okay, that's a little bit of a, again, opening out the questions behind the decisions. Okay, I want to move forward to the 10th of Tevet. The 10th of Tevet is actually the first Holocaust Memorial Day. It was established in December 1948. There were discussions between the American rabbis. I forget the name of the council. It's the Rabbinical Council of America, not that one. Sorry, I can ask you afterwards if you remind me. But American rabbis and the chief rabbin of Israel were discussing how to commemorate the Holocaust, and they went back and forth. Tisha B'Av, not Tisha B'Av. They eventually came on the idea of the 10th of Tevet. Now, the 10th of Tevet is a fast day. It commemorates the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem in the First Temple. Now, one of the things we haven't made a differentiation between so far is a national day of mourning and a fast day, meaning the difference being there's a halachic legal implication to having a fast day. If you have a fast day, then do you do the fast day halachot? Not necessarily fasting, because we can all just decide to fast, but I'm thinking about at Mincha in the afternoon service, we read the Torah and we say, we kind of say the Haftarah, and those kind of things, they come implicated in a fast day, and that becomes more complicated if you want to establish that in modern times. So the chief rabbinate came up with a clever solution, which is take a fast day, which is not particularly well, I don't say well known, that's not really it is well known, but it's not as seriously observed as Tisha B'Av, right? Tisha B'Av is a much more important and significant day in the Jewish calendar than 10th of Tevet, even though that's a little bit harsh to the day which is mentioned in Tanakh and seriously mentioned in Tanakh and emphasized, and it's very much part of halakha. But I think you will understand, I think everyone here that's familiar with the Jewish calendar will understand that in just think like, Lydia Marcus may not be running a 3-part series leading up to the 10th of Tevet. Maybe they will, I don't know. Maybe they'll invite me back to talk about it more. But either way, you get the idea. So you're taking a kind of lesser known Jewish day, which doesn't have the emotional baggage of Tisha B'Av, and you're saying, and by the way, there's no Holocaust connection to the 10th of Tevet. I did a bit of research on it. There's nothing, there's no big event. It's just taking that day and saying, we're going to make that Holocaust Memorial Day. And then you're already fasting, you're already doing all that, right? And we can talk about the Holocaust, and this is the key point, it doesn't negate the story of the 10th of Tevet, because the siege of Jerusalem is not such a big deal relative to this. So it's not like Tisha B'Av, where if you make that Holocaust Memorial Day, you won't talk about all the other tragedies. So what's the problem with this? No one does it. That's the problem. But and you can easily be cynical about this, and I could be cynical and say, look, how many people know about that on the 10th of Tevet? I actually used to work for Eretz Tzvi, the yeshiva, in which is part of the MTA program, as well as, and I ran MTA, and then I worked for Eretz Tzvi. And in Eretz Tzvi, actually, we did do a day of Holocaust programming on the 10th of Tevet. That came before I came in. It was something they decided to do. They essentially, their curriculum was that you focus on the Holocaust, the 10th of Tevet, and at Yom HaShoah. Now, I don't know how many other institutions do that, but maybe that's a success. Maybe that's a success that you do have that day. I want to talk about the name, and I'll come back to the name at the end. And if I don't, you can pull me up on it. But the day of Yom HaKadosh HaKlali, as opposed to Holocaust Memorial Day, is also significant because the chief rabbinate said, and this is important, that this should be the day that anyone who doesn't know when they have a relative who died in the Holocaust, they don't know when the Yortzeit is, this should be the day for their Yortzeit. So for many people, it was also an emotionally important day to give them a day to remember. And that was the chief rabbinate's attempt to have a Holocaust Memorial Day to kind of cover the bases, not be too out there in terms of commemorating a new day. Yes, you're kind of jumping on the bandwagon of the 10th of Tevet, but not such a big deal, essentially. But as I said, not today, not very well commemorated. Okay, moving forward. So Rav Soloveitchik, the famous one, he actually had a very interesting perspective on this. And it's important to know, just because sometimes we often think of all arguments, especially to do with the national character of Israel and the Jewish people, to do with Haredi versus modern Orthodox, and that isn't always the case. This is a good example that is not the case. Rav Soloveitchik felt that Tisha B'Av should be the only commemoration for the Holocaust. He said more than that there shouldn't be kinnot for the Holocaust. Now, we have kinnot. I'm sure in your kinnot books, normally 3. I think Koren has 3. I don't know what you use in Melbourne, but there's normally a few that have been written by rabbis for the Holocaust. Rav Soloveitchik felt that all mourning for national tragedies should be on Tisha B'Av, that no one is of the ability to write the kinnot for the Holocaust, that they don't have the ability to kind of write in the same way that the old kinnot did, and that when you say the kinnot, the traditional kinnot, you should have in mind the current tragedy as well. It's not something that's just a historical event. And this comes back to a Jewish idea that all Jewish festivals, and Tisha B'Av is a festival, is something that reverberates throughout history. And Tisha B'Av, by the way, does have that connotation, and it's not the same as I think anything that makes into the Jewish calendar has some kind of constant reverberation. And that's why there's many Jewish days in history that in the Second Temple, there were loads of days and they got lost. An example of this is there's something called Megillat Ta'anit, lists all the days that the Jewish people in the Second Temple period marked. Nearly all of them have gone. Hanukkah and Purim didn't. One of the reasons why Hanukkah and Purim didn't is because they have a significance that is deeper than just the events. We know that because at Hanukkah, we talk about deeper themes of freedom, of connection to Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, of light, many different things. And that goes deeper than just an event that happens on a day. And the same way, Tisha B'Av, one of the first understandings of Tisha B'Av comes in the Torah when the sin of the spies happens. Read it a few weeks ago, and there is a midrash that says on the sin of the spies, and this is actually my mitzvah parasha, so I have a bit of connection to this one. When the Torah says the people cried on that night, vayivku ha'am balayla hahu, the midrash says you cried tears of chinam, like for nothing. You cried for nothing. Could have gone into the land. There's no reason to cry. I'll give you something to cry about for generations. And that is an understanding that we have an understanding that was on Tisha B'Av. The Midrash says that was on Tisha B'Av, and therefore Tisha B'Av is the day of crying for generations because of that sin. So that's the that kind of, if you like, the understanding of what it means to have a day reverberating around the Jewish calendar. Rav Soloveitchik felt that the Holocaust should be commemorated on Tisha B'Av. Now, by the way, and now this introducing to another theological question, which is beyond the scope of today to answer it, but it is a very important one, which is that when you decide whether to commemorate the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av or not on Tisha B'Av, is also part of that discussion is, can there be a reason for the Holocaust? Now, if you modern religious scholarship, and I'm talking about in let's say the modern Orthodox world, if you read Rav Amital, who's the Rosh Yeshiva of Gush, former Rosh Yeshiva Gush, died a few years ago, and he was a Holocaust survivor. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, a good example, reject the idea that you can have a reason for the Holocaust. It is beyond our understanding. The problem is that when we think about the destructions of old, we do actually ascribe reasons. So, for example, in the Musaf prayer of the Chagim, we say "U'mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu," because of our sins we are exiled from our land. So, one of the challenges of putting the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av is you're putting it into that category, whereas I'm going to say I would say the rabbis that I've definitely looked to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Rav Amital for if I want to understand about approaches to understanding the Holocaust in our time, I will go there. They will say that you can't talk about reason. It defies reason. It is something beyond. It is, and there've been many understandings of how it was a rupture, a new covenant, it changed the relationship between the Jewish people and God. And many people talk about that. And again, it's beyond the scope of this from a theological point of view, religious point of view, covenantal point of view. So that's a challenge. By putting the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av, that is a problem with it. Okay, let's move forward again. Okay, actually, not really moving forward, more contemporary. Rav Soloveitchik. So Menachem Begin. Okay, moving from the rabbis to the prime ministers. Menachem Begin was very much affected by the Holocaust. Okay, it really was kind of he would talk about it all the time. He was so conscious. I mean, one of his, if you like, his motivations in Jewish political life was that there should never be a Holocaust again, and that very much it was present in everything he did. And by the way, I mean, you could argue that every prime minister, including today, it is just an anecdote. Where did Yair Lapid go on becoming prime minister of Israel? Anyone know? What was his first? Where did he go straight to? Anyone know? Yad Vashem, right? Because I mean, his father was a survivor, and so the impact of the Holocaust on Israeli political life, leaders, society today is still reverberating hugely. I mean, it's just, you just take any day and you look in the headlines, you'll see it. You'll see it there, either covertly or some kind of or overtly. Okay, so Menachem Begin, surprisingly, you might add, actually he agreed with Rav Soloveitchik. He went to speak to him about it. And Menachem Begin wanted to get rid of Yom HaShoah, which we're going to speak about next. He actually felt that it should be on Tisha B'Av, which is a very hard to understand perspective. I haven't looked into his perspective in a deep way, but he felt that it should be on Tisha B'Av. He definitely had a sense of Jewish history, and maybe he felt that it was, again, part of the long line of Churban. But either way, that's what he felt. Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, interestingly, who is one of the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Har Etzion, Gush, where Marcus was, he actually is happy that the state did not listen to Rav Soloveitchik, his grandfather. He says that Israel needs a Holocaust Memorial Day, and we can't do it on Tisha B'Av. It needs a day. The survivors need a day. Society needs a day that is decoupled from Tisha B'Av. Although he did say that that's in our generation, leaving the possibility that maybe in the future it won't be so necessary, which again, we'll come back to at the end when we think about where we are in the wider scheme of things. But that's an interesting to note about Rav Moshe Lichtenstein. I will add, sorry, one more anecdote I'll say about Menachem Begin. He convened a kind of a conference to discuss his idea of getting rid of Yom HaShoah for Tisha B'Av, and everyone disagreed with him, so he dropped the idea. So again, nothing really happened with that. Okay, so first approach, yet another Churban. I think we've seen lots of different understandings, like practical suggestions, theological implications, questions before we move on to part two. And feel free to ask at the end as well. You can write your questions down. Okay, right, let's move on. So the second approach is a dedicated national day, which I think, I'm sure you probably would have guessed based on what we've been speaking about, because it's the obvious opposite to that, which is let's not commemorate the Holocaust on an existing Jewish day. Let's create a new day. So the day that we have for that is the 27th of Nisan, which is Yom HaShoah. Had two names. Okay, in 1951, it was set up as Yom HaShoah Merid HaGetaot, and the day of the Holocaust and the Ghetto Revolt Day. And in 1959, it was codified into Jewish law as Yom HaZikaron Shoah U'Gvura, the day of remembrance of the Holocaust and of strength. So we can't not talk about this approach without understanding a little bit about secular Zionism and the secular leadership of the State of Israel and their approach to the Holocaust. Now, again, there is a lot more scope to talk about that. Maybe we can do another time, because it's a very, very interesting topic. Essentially, the early Zionists, the kind of Ben Gurion and the left, the Labour, it wasn't called the Labour Party then, but the party that became Labour, that ran Israel without interruption from 1948 and really before, but from when the state was created, 1948 until Begin came in 77, they had a very specific understanding of the Holocaust. It came under their understanding of Galut, of what it means to be in exile, and the Geula of redemption. And if you are familiar with the religious Zionist world, you may know that Galut and Geula play a very big role in the religious Zionist understanding, but it's very different in the secular Zionist understanding. If you like, Geula as a religious concept, we think about redemption, the future Mashiach redemption. Many religious Zionists would say that the state of Israel is the beginning of that Geula. For the secular Zionists, they felt that the state of Israel was Geula, it was redemption, and the secular state of it was the redemption, that we've thrown off the shackles of religion. Essentially. Now, there's different strands of secular Zionist thinking. This isn't the only one, but it is a strong one, and it's a strand that says that essentially the Torah was important for the Jewish people in the exile because they needed to keep their identity. But now we don't need that. We're in our own country. We can be like the other nations. We can do things with our Jewish character. Someone like, for example, David Ben Gurion did not want to get rid of the Tanakh. He loved the Tanakh. He wanted to create a Jewish country, but not necessarily a religious country. And part of that understanding is the concept of shlilat hagola, the negative, not negativity, there's a word for I'm thinking, which is the negation of the diaspora. Now, why did I give that introduction? Because when those people looked at the Holocaust, what they saw in their mind, their framing was that the Jews in Europe went to their deaths like sheep to the slaughter, as opposed to the brave Zionists in Israel who are fighting for independence. Now, looking back nowadays, that is a very unfair and incorrect way of looking at history. And Israeli society has moved away from that understanding. Yad Vashem have, the leaders of the state have, society has, because just one example for now, like look at the names and look at the difference in how we understand it. Originally, the day was Merid HaGetaot. What did the secular Zionists want to commemorate more than anything? It was the day, or the concept of uprising. That spoke to them. That's what you commemorate, not the many stories of the Jews going to their deaths. And that showed a lack of understanding of the life that Jews lived. It wasn't always possible to rebel. they didn't know what was coming. It wasn't like they looked back at history and said, oh, this would be a good time to rebel. Like, who are you rebelling against when Poles and other European countries don't always, the peoples, the Lithuanians, Belarusians aren't always there to help you? With what? Are you kind of abandoning your family and not going to look for food because you're now going to set a rebellion? All of these questions, and again, this is one of the hugest dilemmas of the Holocaust, and it's not simple to just say, well, obviously they were right to create an uprising. That was I mean, I'm not here to say that they were or weren't. I don't think anyone can, but it was a dilemma, and it happened in Warsaw and other places as well. The early state, the early leaders of the state had a very strong view on this, and that's why they created Yom HaShoah Commemorate the Holocaust, which essentially was saying that this is what we commemorate, this is what we can recognize, but really it's a dilemma. And the later change to Shoah Gvura is a nod to that. There's no question that Gvura, the strength, was definitely referring to the uprisings, and the date is also important. We're going to get to the date in a second, but nowadays we understand it's because Gvura is a bit more open to broad interpretation than ghetto uprising. So now we can keep the name and we can talk about Gvura in a much broader sense. The Gvura, the heroism of Mordechai Nilevich and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the partisans. Yes, that was Gvura. That was heroism. But so were the Jews who decided to live every day. So were the people who looked after their families, sometimes at risk of their own life. The people who decided to share their food with others in the camps. Even those who might not have been able to. There is no one way to define heroism. I don't think that it is possible to even start labeling things as heroic, because when you understand the context of what they were living through, what Jews were living through at that time, it is impossible to even start. So, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why there's no concept of righteous among the nations for Jews, because yes, the Israeli state honors righteous Gentiles, but how can you even start to honor Jews when everyone had their own story? There's no one has a monopoly on the right things to do and what's possible, what's deserving of honor. That's definitely it's not possible. So again, the state of Israel has changed. It hasn't changed that name, but it has changed the understanding of what Yom HaShoah represents. And today it's very much a day of commemoration, not necessarily of kind of championing certain elements like the uprisings above others. But the date, I want to talk about the date because the date was 27th of Nisan has no significance, okay, in the as things that happened on that day. The day that was originally mooted for it was the 14th of Nisan. And anyone who knows the Jewish calendar will know that on that day, they are not busy commemorating the Holocaust. They are busy cleaning their houses for Pesach. Okay, because it's Erev Pesach, and that was the date of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the beginning of the uprising. Again, commemorating the beginning and not the ends, because the fact that it was always going to be ended. I mean, they weren't trying to win. It wasn't possible to beat the Nazis, but the very idea of rebellion, that's what they wanted to commemorate. However, people said you can't really do a day on Erev Pesach as a commemoration for the Holocaust, so it's the compromise of the 27th of Nisan. Why then particularly? I think partly because Nisan in the Jewish calendar is a happy month. We don't say Tachanun. I'm not sure if it's happy because we don't say Tachanun or it's because it's don't say anyway. But it's a happy month, and the 27th of Nisan. So they wanted the secular state wanted it in the same month as the Ghetto Uprising. Religious weren't so happy about it. So 27th of Nisan is towards the end, and it's also time in the Omer, so therefore it was a compromise. But there's nothing significant about it. What I would say though is it's a week before Yom HaZikaron. Okay, and that is important as well, because by putting it there, you are you are making a claim that there is a connection between the Holocaust and the state of Israel, which is a big one, essentially. And again, chronology tells us that there is a connection. You can't ignore the fact that the Holocaust was in the early 1940s, finishing 1945, and the state of Israel in 1948. But we have to be very, very careful about the linkage between them. Rav Amital has a very important book about it. And I think the way I will talk about it is, yes, you can't divorce reality. That happens. We have to talk about the two of them, but we have to be very, very, very careful in how we talk about it, because we don't want to chas v'shalom say things like, well, the Holocaust happened. Sorry, the state of Israel happened because of the Holocaust. It was okay, we had the Holocaust because we had the state of Israel later. All these kind of lazy, trite comparisons that I've heard that people say, and we have to be very, very careful. Two momentous, life-changing, epoch-changing events happened in the 1940s. There are connections, mainly because people lived through them. We need to understand both of them in their right context, but and there's an emotional connection there, especially when there are many Holocaust survivors who came to Israel. So it's one of those things that it's very hard to like really kind of uncouple. There's a lot of baggage that comes with that, and I'm sure many of you might feel this as well. When it comes to this time of year, we are emotional at Yom HaShoah, and then a week later you're emotional at Yom HaZikaron, and you can't not go to Yom HaZikaron with that, like you remember what you felt a week ago. That's just the nature of it. So the creation of that date, there is an intention there, right? Yom HaShoah takes place on Yad Vashem, in Yad Vashem. Yom HaZikaron takes place in Har Herzl. Now, it also takes place in shuls and communities and homes, but those two places are key, and they're next to each other. So there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot to unpack there. Okay, so you've got the idea, I think, hopefully, of this approach. A dedicated national day. The challenge, meaning that the challenges of this day specifically, meaning that it's come with a lot of baggage to do with secular Zionist ideology, but it has been much more recognized in recent years by around the world. 27th of Nisan is very much a kind of important day, and also really important is it's during term time, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. I don't know in Australia, sorry, but in Israel and in England is okay. In England and America and Israel, it's during term time, and therefore it's easier to talk about than Tisha B'Av, which is in the middle of winter. I've been taught 2 Tisha B'Avs in Australia, much better than doing it in England when it goes out like 10:30 at night. But yeah, so Tisha B'Av, that's one of the problems, is during the summer. So when do you educate about it, especially children at school? So that's the dedicated national day. Now, approach 3, I'm going to do a little quicker because this one is not as relevant really to us, but I wanted to let you know about it, which is the idea of constant memorialization. And I don't think this is practical, but I just wanted to mention it to you. I wanted to show that there were different approaches. And if you research this, there are so many other dates. There's a pamphlet called Im Eshkachech Gola, if I forget you, Gola, exile, that suggested 8 days of commemoration. So I'm not going to talk about them massively, but I'll briefly mention them. 11th of Nisan. Why the 11th of Nisan? Because it was a day of rebellion and uprising of ghetto prisoners. I'm not sure if that was connected to Warsaw. Again, it's not really practical. You're preparing for Pesach, but this book suggested that we should commemorate all of these 8 days. That one, the 20th of Sivan, which was a day that was memorialized the Shmelniki massacres in the 1648-50 period, when a lot of hundreds of thousands of Jews in Ukraine were massacred by Chmelnytsky and the Cossacks. And there was a fast day set up. And by the way, until the Holocaust, Jews around Poland would mark the 20th of Sivan. So they wanted to kind of continue that day. And that's, by the way, it's just interesting because we've forgotten about it. No one marks the 20th of Sivan, but that was a huge day and hundreds of thousands of Jews died. And we should remember that, right? We do remember a little bit by saying Avarachamim and Shul. And I'm going to say it an aside, by the way. I actually sometimes have more kavanah for Avarachamim and Shul than anything else, because I really try very hard to think about these things. We say it when it's not a happy day, so to speak, in Shabbat, at Musaf. And this is sometimes the only thing we have to remember some of these tragedies. So I really try and do that, and have kavanah for that. So it's something we can take into our shul. But anyway, the 20th of Sivan. Thursday night before Parashat Chukat, the burning of the red heifer, we don't really know why. So we will remember the Holocaust, that concept. Tisha B'Av, we spoke about 10th of Tevet, we spoke about Shabbat Zachor, the destruction of Amalek and Haman. There's a connection between Haman, who wanted to destroy the Jews, and Hitler. So let's commemorate it then. Sorry, 1 second. Thursday night before Parashat Vayikra. Vayikra is what children learn. There's a tradition that children learn Vayikra at the beginning. So the idea is to remember the day, the children, and the murder of the 1.5 million children, a Thursday night before Parashat Vayikra. And the other one is every Thursday night. The idea was that there's a kind of a Seder, there's a learning of Mishnah. There's like I don't know if it's Mishnah Yomi, but the idea of that each week that you learn a different piece of Mishnah and you choose a letter of your deceased's relatives, your relative's name, and when you get to the Mishnah which starts with their name, you choose that Thursday night. I'm just showing you because, again, this is not really so practical for us, but for many, they felt the Holocaust loomed so large in their lives that we need to have almost a kind of calendar-wide commemoration for it. Okay, I want to leave time for questions, and I realize I'm getting to the end. So I'm going to move to what I'm going to call today's reality. And I will suggest an approach for how I understand, if you like, where we can go with this, but also an inherent problem. And I would love to hear your views. Today, there are really 4 main days for commemorating the Holocaust in the Jewish calendar. Yom HaShoah, which you spoke about, Tisha B'Av, the Fast of Tevet, which you could say it's arguable, it's there because it's not very well commemorated, but I'm going to go with it because I think it was still, it's still established, it's still kind of in the liturgy to some degree. Some people say a memorial prayer, I'll go with it. And the other one is Holocaust Memorial Day, which was established in, I believe, 2005 on the 27th of January to commemorate the liberation of Auschwitz. And certainly where I'm from in England, that is a big deal. Less so in Israel, not necessarily for Israel, but in England, it's a very big day. I don't know in Australia if it's also not so good because it's during the summer holidays, but you can tell me afterwards how big it is, but in England it is. I want to suggest that we could take these 4 days and we should commemorate different aspects of the Holocaust on them, and that will help us to understand and educate about the Holocaust, which is ultimately one of our main goals of all of these days, to remember, to commemorate, but also to educate, especially as, and I'm sure everyone knows that, appreciates this, that we are a generation who are uniquely placed to do this, distanced from the Holocaust so that we do understand it in historical context, but that we know survivors, we've spoken to them, we sense the Holocaust does play a huge role in our lives, but in our grandchildren's lives, it won't be as strong unless we understand how to get the education right. So I want to suggest that maybe on Yom HaShoah is a day when we can talk about the Holocaust in a national Jewish sense. I want to suggest Yom HaShoah is the day for Jewish peoplehood, commemorating the Holocaust on a national level, and specifically the role of survivors within that, as opposed to the Fast of Tevet, which is more about commemorating Holocaust victims. Now, why do I say that? Because the 10th of Tevet is about Kaddish, Yom HaKaddish HaKlali. That was the day to commemorate those who we don't know when their yortzites were. Maybe we could extend that and commemorate all the people that we don't know. We don't have 6 million names. We have 4.5 million names. So maybe the 10th of Tevet could be a time when we look at the abyss and we commemorate the victims. Yom HaShoah can be a time when we focus on the survivors and we focus on the Jewish nation and the story of the Jewish people, how that's affected the Jewish people. So it could be stories of communities, stories of people, and seeing, that like how the Holocaust has shaped Jewish history. There are two different themes. Tisha B'Av, I don't think should be, again, I feel bad, wrong saying that. I mean, I appreciate that, there's a rabbinical argument and not everyone agrees with Rav Soloveitchik, but Rav Soloveitchik, I'm not going to argue but if you like, I would say the broad strokes approach in the modern Orthodox community today is to commemorate Tisha B'Av in some way for the Holocaust, but not to overload it, because we can't forget the destruction of the temple and other kind of periods of Jewish history. So for me, when I get to Tisha B'Av, I think it is important. I do say Kinot for the Holocaust. I think I sometimes read or watch a film about it, but when I do my reading, I often don't only read about the Holocaust. I do think about the broad kind of swathe of Jewish history, and I try and I kind of combine the Rav Soloveitchik idea with the approaches that say, we should commemorate the Holocaust. The Rav Soloveitchik idea of kind of let's learn about the Crusades, let's learn about the Spanish Inquisition, and appreciate that, but also putting some kind of focus by also saying the Kinot. And the Holocaust Memorial Day in January, I think, is a day to tell our story to the non-Jewish world, because I think all the other three are very much in a Jewish world, and I think obviously it is very important to tell the world what happened and to educate externally as well as internally, and that I think should be the Holocaust Memorial Day. So that isn't a day necessarily to do something in your shul, but it might be a day to put a Facebook post, organize an event at your workplace, thinking about external commemoration. However, and this is my final point, and then I'll open for questions. None of these address the fundamental issue of how will Jews in 300 years' time relate, because it's unclear that they will find any of these days to be helpful. Holocaust Memorial Day is not even something religious. I think we need something religious, something ceremonial, like the Pesach Seder, or or Yom Ha'atzmaut Hallel, to bring something and enshrine it. So the Holocaust Memorial Day is for the world. That's not really us. 10th of Tevet is not really, it's becoming less relevant, as I'm sure it was very relevant for people who had survivors who they didn't know the yortzites of, but that's not going to be relevant in hundreds of years' time, unfortunately. Tisha B'Av will always be dominated by other things as well. And Yom HaShoah, which has the best bet, doesn't have a religious commemoration. By the way, Rabbi Sachs tried to create some kind of formal religious ceremony, and I don't think his success his efforts were successful. And if you're interested, you can ask me more about it, because I was a little bit involved in that at the time, because I was in part of the steering committee to running his Yom HaShoah event, which was a very good commemoration, but didn't succeed in his goal of enshrining Yom HaShoah, at least in the way that he wanted to. And therefore, we have a question. What do we do? On this one hand, maybe it's only for kind of rabbinical impetus to kind of, maybe they will be a fast day, but it's hard to say that's going to be reality. But maybe it's just our job to ensure that Yom HaShoah has something to it. Maybe we need to create a Seder, like in a sad version, if you like, of the Seder. In the same way, by the way, there were efforts to do that in America in post-war in the 50s. There were, if you're interested, I can send it to you. But that question I'm leaving to you. So yes, I'm going to now finish, because my time is up, and I will take questions. But really, as I said, the most important question is for all of us, which is that's been the survey. But how are we going to pass this on to our students? And and children. And I do think that we have what to work with. The most important thing being that we use the Jewish calendar in a way that we can really convey the importance and the deep significance of the Holocaust to the Jewish people for all time. That's the challenge. I leave it up to you. Questions? Marcus? Anyone?
We have a question in the chat. Do you want to read?
Oh, I didn't see it. Okay, good question. I'm not going to answer that question because I actually I'm not an expert on it. I did read about it recently, and I don't have enough to answer you. There is I'll see if I can point you in the direction of article. I'll send to Marcus, but I don't have the Tanakh knowledge to like kind of offhand to tell you about the word Shoah. Sorry. And yes, good point about the 10th of Tevet being a short fast, not the day to be in Australia.
Can I ask? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned there's like a halachic and significance.
You're very what's it called? Try again.
So you mentioned
Can't hear. Zalmi, is it just me or can?
I could hear you well. I think it's the connection.
No, that you could. Well, no, you could hear Liddy well.
No, I could hear you well. I can't hear Liddy.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
I want to jump onto your phone. Is this conversation being had at Yad Vashem?
Which of the many?
Just trying to establish a unified and kind of more religious ceremonial day.
I don't work in Yad Vashem, but I would say I doubt it. Yad Vashem is not. Look, Yad Vashem is not ultimately religious. It's a state body, right? It's not a religious. I mean, it used to be kind of very disconnected, if you like, from religion. I think less so now. I know Rav Lau is the has a position. The president, I don't want to get the term wrong, but I don't think that there is a real debate about religious commemoration of Yom HaShoah. It's not something that I think it is. I'm bringing it up as a kind of like thinking about the next few hundred years. And for example, the Rabbi J.J. Schachter has an article in Tradition which talks about Holocaust commemoration. He says at the end that he's not really satisfied in the kind of what I said. He's not really satisfied with it. So he's saying we need more than this. But at the moment, Yom HaShoah has been very successful as a Memorial Day. I don't deny that. I think that it's true that the Haredi community doesn't tend to memorialize it for fairly obvious reasons, having done the Shiur, but the modern Orthodox religious Zionist community and the secular community very much does. There's no religious element to it. It has not become objectionable, if you like, right? So on that day, on Yom HaShoah, we don't say Tachanan, meaning it's like a happy day, but we do, you have events, and there's nothing wrong with educational events. But I think that this question is more for like future generations. I don't think it's a hot button topic now about because the Yom HaShoah is doing fine. It will be a question when people stop commemorating Yom HaShoah. People will talk about it maybe in 50 years' time, maybe less. Liddy, do you want to try again?
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear little bits. Maybe write in the chat.
Maybe go on your phone. If you want to log in on your phone, it might be a better connection.
Yeah. Thank you, David, for that source. Good. I would not have been able to quote Stefania. Any other questions while Lizzie's writing hers? Anyone on YouTube? Sorry, go on, Zami. Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Well, yeah.
Are we gonna work out the questions, or should we?
Ah, okay.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. No problem. No problem. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll come to Australia soon, and I'm sure if we do, we'll come to Hamayan.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you
Michael.
very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcus.
Right.
Pleasure.
Right.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
really great.